July 5th, 1984. Naples, Italy. Roberto Castellano stood in the press box at Stadio San Paolo, watching Diego Maradona step off the team bus to a chorus of jeers and rotten vegetables. 20,000 Napoli fans had come to welcome their new savior. Instead, they spat on him. Roberto had his camera ready. His editor wanted the humiliation captured for tomorrow's front page. But when Roberto looked through his lens, he saw something else. 3 men in expensive suits watching from the very important person section, smiling as Maradona ducked flying bottles. Roberto recognized one face: Salvatore Giuliano, the most powerful Camorra boss in southern Italy. In that moment, Roberto realized this wasn't about football. This was about control, about money, about a plan so elaborate it would reshape everything. He never wrote that story. 38 years later, that silence had cost him everything he loved. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Roberto's hands trembled as he lowered the camera, the weight of what he'd witnessed settling like lead in his stomach. Around him, other journalists scribbled frantically, crafting headlines about Maradona's disgraceful welcome and the ungrateful Neapolitan fans. They saw only the surface, the chaos, the humiliation, the theater. But Roberto's eyes remained fixed on Salvatore Giuliano, who had just nodded to a man Roberto recognized as Michele Zaza, head of a rival Camorra clan. In 30 years of covering football across Italy, Roberto had learned to read the language of power. This choreographed hostility wasn't spontaneous fan rage, it was a message. The crowd's jeers grew louder as Maradona stumbled, a tomato splashing across his white shirt. The Argentine superstar's face crumpled with confusion and hurt. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Barcelona had sold him to Napoli for a world record fee, promising he'd be treated like a king in the football-mad South. Roberto's press credentials gave him access to the tunnel, but his feet wouldn't move. Every instinct screamed at him to follow the story, to corner Giuliano, to ask the questions that needed asking. But another voice, the one that had kept him alive covering organized crime for 2 decades, whispered warnings. His editor's voice crackled through his earpiece. "Castellano, where are my shots? The wire services are already running with this. Getting them now." Roberto lied, his camera still hanging unused around his neck. As the crowd began to disperse, Roberto watched Giuliano's group move with practiced efficiency toward the exits. No pushing, no shoving. The sea of angry fans parted for them like they were ghosts. Roberto had seen this before in Milan, in Rome, in Turin. The invisible hand that guided football's billions always belonged to men in expensive suits who never touched a ball. He thought of his daughter Sofia, 17 and burning with dreams of playing professional football. She trained 6 days a week at a small club in Buenos Aires, believing that talent and determination were enough. Roberto had never told her how the game really worked, how careers were made and destroyed in boardrooms and back alleys, not on training pitches. The stadium was nearly empty when Roberto finally descended to pitch level. Maradona's abandoned bus sat like a wounded animal, its windows cracked, vegetable matter sliding down its sides. A groundskeeper was already hosing down the concrete where the Argentine had stood. "Shameful," the old man muttered in heavily accented Italian. "We waited 70 years for a champion, and this is how we greet him?" Roberto knelt and picked up a crumpled program from the ground. Maradona's face smiled up at him from the cover, airbrushed and hopeful. The headline read, "Our Savior arrives." "It wasn't meant for him," Roberto said quietly. "What?" "Nothing." Roberto pocketed the program and walked away. The drive back to his hotel through Naples' narrow streets gave Roberto time to think. The other journalists would file their stories about fan disappointment and cultural clashes. They'd write about unrealistic expectations and the pressure on modern football stars. Safe stories, sellable stories. But Roberto had glimpsed something else, a conspiracy that went deeper than sport, that touched the very foundations of how football operated in Italy. The Camorra's involvement in Calcio was an open secret, but this felt different, more coordinated, more dangerous. In his hotel room, Roberto spread his notes across the small desk, phone numbers of sources. contact information for Camorra experts, the framework for an investigation that could change everything. He picked up the phone 3 times before finally dialing. Pronto? His editor's voice was sharp with deadline pressure. Giorgio, it's Roberto. About today's story. Please tell me you got the photos. The humiliation angle is perfect. Golden Boy's rude awakening for the front page. Roberto looked at his camera, its memory card full of unused potential. I got them. But there's something else here, something bigger. A pause. What do you mean bigger? The reception wasn't organic. It was orchestrated. I saw Giuliano and Zaza together, watching it unfold like they'd planned it. The silence stretched long enough that Roberto wondered if the connection had dropped. Roberto, Giorgio's voice was careful now. You're talking about very dangerous people. People who don't like journalists asking questions. That's exactly why we need to ask them. No, absolutely not. File your story about the fans and Maradona. Keep it clean, keep it simple, keep us all breathing. Roberto stared out his window at the Bay of Naples, its waters dark under the evening sky. Somewhere in this ancient city, Diego Maradona was probably alone in another hotel room, wondering what he'd gotten himself into. Somewhere else, men in expensive suits were planning their next move in a game whose rules Roberto was only beginning to understand. He hung up the phone without responding to his editor. The story would wait. The truth would wait. 38 years later, as Roberto stood behind his newspaper stand in Buenos Aires watching his world crumble, he would remember this as the moment he chose silence over courage, the moment he chose safety over his daughter's future, the moment everything began to unravel. The smell of ink and yesterday's coffee permeated Roberto's small news kiosk like a confession he couldn't escape. 15 years of selling other people's stories, watching headlines blur together in an endless cycle of sports scores, political scandals, and celebrity gossip. His fingers, once steady enough to capture history through a camera lens, now trembled slightly as he arranged the morning papers, their front pages shouting about Argentina's latest economic crisis. Peso plunges to historic low. Inflation reaches 40%. Government promises reform. The same headlines, different numbers. Roberto had stopped believing in promises long ago. From his corner position on Avenida Corrientes, he could see the early morning commuters hurrying past, office workers clutching smartphones, students with earbuds, elderly porteños shuffling toward the cafe where they'd spend hours arguing about Boca Juniors' latest transfer. None of them looked at the newspapers anymore. Why buy yesterday's news when tomorrow's scandals were already trending online? Roberto's hands moved through their familiar routine, straightening the sports papers, checking the magazine rack, counting the coins in his metal box. The physical ritual helped quiet the memories that surfaced every morning like ghosts refusing burial. Naples, 1984. Diego Maradona's humiliated face. Salvatore Giuliano's knowing nod. The phone call where courage died. Roberto, your usual philosopher customer is coming. The voice belonged to Carmen, who ran the flower stand 3 kiosks down. She was 60-something with silver hair and laugh lines earned from decades of Buenos Aires street wisdom. In the underground economy of vendors, she'd become Roberto's closest friend, perhaps his only friend. Roberto looked up to see Professor Martinez approaching, briefcase in one hand, exact change in the other. For 7 years, the retired literature professor had bought La Nación Andole every morning, always pausing to discuss whatever caught his philosophical fancy. Buenos dias, Roberto. I see they're calling for Maradona's statue to be moved again. Martinez placed his coins on the counter with practiced precision, the 4th location in 10 years. Even in bronze, Diego can't find peace. Roberto's chest tightened. Since Maradona's death 2 years ago, every mention felt like a needle finding the same tender spot. People see what they want to see, he managed. Ah, but that's the tragedy, isn't it? We make myths of our heroes, then punish them for being human. Martinez studied Roberto's face with the intensity of someone who'd spent decades reading between lines. You have the look of a man carrying stories, my friend. Heavy ones. Before Roberto could respond, his phone buzzed, a text message. His heart lurched when he saw the sender, Sophia. Papa, we need to talk. It's important. Roberto stared at the screen until the letters blurred. His daughter's messages came rarely now. Birthday wishes, awkward holiday greetings, the minimum contact their fractured relationship could sustain. She'd moved to Madrid 5 years ago, chasing dreams of coaching professional women's football after her playing career ended in shadows and accusations. The accusations he'd helped create through his silence. "Bad news?" Martinez asked gently. "My daughter." Roberto pocketed the phone without responding. "She lives in Spain now. Family is the weight that keeps us anchored, and the current that pulls us under." The professor tucked his newspapers under his arm. "Sometimes the same tide that drowns us is the one we must learn to swim." After Martinez disappeared into the morning crowd, Roberto found himself staring at the sports pages. Maradona's face gazed back from a retrospective article about the 1986 World Cup. The photo captured him in pure joy, arms raised in triumph, eyes blazing with the certainty of destiny fulfilled. Roberto remembered that tournament differently. He'd covered it as a rising sports journalist, watching from press boxes as Maradona single-handedly carried Argentina to glory. But by then, Roberto already carried the weight of Naples. The investigation abandoned, the truth buried, the compromises that would metastasize into full corruption. The morning rush intensified around him. Construction workers grabbed tabloids with one hand while balancing coffee with the other. A young woman counted coins twice before buying a magazine, her careful mathematics speaking to an economy where every peso mattered. An elderly man argued with Carmen about flour prices, their voices mixing Spanish and Italian in the musical patois of Buenos Aires immigration. Roberto's world had shrunk to this corner, this routine, this careful distance from the stories that once defined him. No bylines, no deadlines, no choices between truth and survival. Just the simple transaction of selling other people's words, other people's courage. But Sophia's text pulsed like a heartbeat in his pocket. "We need to talk. It's important." He'd protected her once by staying silent. He'd destroyed her later through the same silence. The mathematics of fatherhood had never balanced in his ledger. As the morning sun climbed higher over Buenos Aires, Roberto arranged his newspapers one more time and waited. For customers, for answers, for the past to finally release its grip on his throat. In 6 hours, a phone call would shatter this careful equilibrium forever. The phone rang at exactly 2:15 in the afternoon, cutting through the post-lunch lull like a blade through silence. Roberto had been organizing the evening editions when the harsh electronic trill made his hands freeze mid-motion. The number on the display was international, Italian prefix, but unrecognized. Pronto? The word escaped his lips in Italian without thought, muscle memory from decades past. Heavy breathing filled the line. Then a voice, gravelly and weak, speaking in the thick Neapolitan dialect that still haunted Roberto's dreams, Roberto Castellano. The journalist who forgot how to see. Roberto's knees buckled. He gripped the counter edge, newspapers scattering to the concrete. Around him, the afternoon bustle of Avenida Corrientes continued. Car horns, vendor calls, the distant tango music from a street performer. But the sounds felt muffled, as if filtered through water. "Who is this?" "You know who this is." A wet cough crackled through the connection. Or you would, if you hadn't spent 40 years hiding behind other people's headlines. The voice carried death in its undertones, the wheeze of a man measuring time in breaths rather than days. But underneath the decay, Roberto heard the unmistakable authority that had once commanded Naples's underworld with a nod. "Salvatore Giuliano," Roberto whispered. "Don Salvatore, you disrespectful bastard. Even dying, I deserve respect." Roberto's vision blurred. The old Camorra boss, the man he'd watched orchestrate Maradona's humiliation 38 years ago, was supposed to be dead. The newspapers had covered his funeral in 2009, complete with flowers from half of Naples' political establishment and a police presence that shut down 3 city blocks. "You're dead?" A sound that might have been laughter if it weren't so bitter. The Roberto Castellano I remember would have asked better questions. Like, why a dead man needs to make confession to a coward. The words hit like physical blows. Carmen looked over from her flower stand with concern, but Roberto turned away, pressing the phone closer to his ear. "What do you want?" "To fix what you broke." To give you the story you were too yellow to write. Another wet cough. Maradona's welcome in Naples. You saw the truth that day, didn't you? You understood what happened. Roberto's mouth went dry. The reception was staged. Bravo. The journalist awakens. Giuliano's voice carried mockery but also something else, urgency. But you never asked why. You never dug deeper. You took your pictures and ran home to your safe little articles about disappointed fans. My editor. Your editor was bought, like half the press corps in Italy. But you... The line went silent except for labored breathing. You could have been different. You could have uncovered everything. Roberto closed his eyes, but the memories flooded back anyway. The coordinated nature of the crowd's hostility, Michel Zaza's presence, the way security had stepped back at precisely the right moment to allow maximum humiliation. He'd seen it all, understood its implications, then chosen silence. Why are you calling me now? Because I'm dying, really dying this time. Pancreatic cancer, if you must know. And because your daughter's investigation in Madrid is getting close to truths that will get her killed. The words struck Roberto like ice water. Sofia? You think corruption stays contained? You think the networks we built in the 80s just disappeared? Giuliano's voice gained strength, fed by anger. Your precious girl is investigating match-fixing in Spanish women's football. She doesn't know she's pulling threads that lead back to Naples, back to us. Roberto's knees gave out completely. He slumped against his kiosk, the phone pressed to his ear like a lifeline to hell. What does Sofia have to do with everything? Her playing career ended because of fixes connected to the same network that controlled Maradona's transfer. The same network you could have exposed if you'd grown a spine in Naples. The breathing grew heavier. She's trying to clear her name by investigating the corruption that destroyed her. Noble, stupid, fatal. The afternoon sun felt suddenly cold on Roberto's skin. Sofia's text from the morning took on new weight. We need to talk. It's important. What do you want from me? Redemption. For both of us. Papers rustled on Giuliano's end. I have documents, photographs, recorded conversations. Everything you need to write the story that explains how Diego became a god, how Naples changed, how organized crime evolved through football. In exchange for what? You save your daughter's life. You tell the truth about 1984, and you let an old bastard die with one clean deed on his conscience. Roberto's hands shook as he processed the magnitude of what Giuliano was offering. The story he'd abandoned, the truth he'd buried, the chance to finally understand why Diego Maradona's humiliation had been necessary for his transformation. The phone line crackled with static and dying breaths. Do we have a deal, Roberto Castellano? Roberto looked at his newspapers, his small safe world, his carefully constructed distance from the past. Then he thought of Sofia, brilliant and determined, walking unknowingly toward the same destruction he'd helped create. Yes, he whispered. The word tasted like salvation and damnation combined. The phone went dead in Roberto's hand, leaving only the static hiss of a connection severed across continents. He stared at the device as if it might ring again, might offer him a chance to take back the word that had just changed everything. Around him, Buenos Aires continued its afternoon rhythm, vendors calling prices, car engines gunning at red lights, the eternal percussion of a city that never questioned its own momentum. But Roberto's carefully constructed world had cracked open like an egg, exposing the rot he'd spent 15 years trying to contain. Roberto, you look like you've seen a ghost. Carmen abandoned her flower arrangements and crossed to his kiosk, her weathered face creased with concern. I'm fine, he said automatically, the lie coming as easily as breathing. His hands shook as he attempted to reorganize the scattered newspapers, but the headlines blurred together. Economic crisis deepens, football corruption scandal, former player dies mysteriously in Madrid. The last one stopped him cold. He'd dismissed it this morning as routine sports page filler, but now every word felt weighted with menace. Former player, Madrid, mysteriously. You're not fine, you're white as milk. Carmen's voice carried the authority of someone who'd survived 63 years in Buenos Aires by reading people better than newspapers. Who was on the phone? Roberto's throat constricted. Even mentioning Giuliano's name felt like invoking a curse. Someone from my past, from when I was a journalist. The past has claws, Carmen said quietly, especially the parts we try to bury. A customer approached, an elderly man wanting clarin, and Roberto fumbled through the transaction, miscounting change twice before getting it right. His fingers felt thick and clumsy, disconnected from his brain. When the man left with a puzzled backward glance, Roberto realized he'd been speaking Italian without noticing. He pulled out his phone and scrolled to Sophia's message. "We need to talk. It's important." The timestamp showed 7:23 a.m. Madrid time. She'd been awake early, probably couldn't sleep, probably scared. Roberto started typing a response 3 times, deleting each attempt. What could he say? Don't investigate anything? Come home immediately? I'm sorry I destroyed your life, and now I might have to destroy it again to save it? Call her, Carmen said, reading over his shoulder with the shameless directness of long friendship. I can't. Can't or won't. Roberto's phone buzzed with another message, this one from an unknown number. Check your email. Study everything. Trust no one except Carmen Flores, who sells flowers and used to sell information before she got smart. SG. Ice flooded Roberto's veins. Giuliano knew about Carmen, had been watching, researching, preparing for this call, which meant others might be watching too. Roberto looked at his friend with new eyes, seeing past the silver hair and laugh lines to something harder underneath. Carmen met his gaze steadily, and for a moment neither spoke. Information? Roberto asked quietly. Carmen's smile was sad and knowing. You think a flower vendor makes enough to survive in this neighborhood? I had other income streams. Past tense, before you ask. Been clean for 15 years. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you tell me you were hiding from the Camorra? They stared at each other across the gulf of their mutual secrets. Around them, the afternoon crowd thickened. Office workers heading home, students gathering at cafe tables, the eternal dance of urban life. But Roberto felt suddenly exposed, as if invisible crosshairs had settled on his back. His laptop was at home in his small apartment 6 blocks away. The walk there felt like crossing a minefield now that he knew Giuliano's reach extended even here, even to Carmen's flower stand. But the alternative, remaining ignorant while Sophia walked toward destruction, was unthinkable. I have to go, he said, beginning to pack up his kiosk 2 hours early. Roberto. Carmen's voice stopped him. Whatever this is about, whatever you did or didn't do 40 years ago, running won't fix it. I learned that the hard way. I'm not running. I'm trying to save my daughter. From what? The question hung between them like smoke. Roberto realized he couldn't answer without explaining everything. Naples, Maradona, the investigation he'd abandoned, the corruption that had metastasized through decades of his silence. The web was too complex, too dangerous to unravel in fragments. I don't know yet, he said finally, but I will. As he wheeled his cart toward the storage space he rented behind a nearby cafe, Roberto felt eyes on him. Not paranoia, the specific weight of professional observation. A man in an expensive suit reading a newspaper too intently. A woman speaking quietly into her phone while pretending to window shop. They weren't hiding. They wanted him to know he was being watched. The message was clear. You're in the game now, whether you want to be or not. Roberto quickened his pace, Giuliano's words echoing in his mind. Trust no one except Carmen Flores. In a world where the dead made phone calls and old friends sold more than flowers, that list felt dangerously short.